Hi, Bob. Look at that. You're in 4 different places at the same time.
That's right. That's because there's only 4 monitors. I could easily be just in 40 places at the same time.
And I suppose if we had 1,000 monitors, you could be in 1,000 places at the same time.
Sounds like a game. I'll tell you what. I'll take your 1,000, raise you 2,000. We can go on and on forever.
And you know, Bob, that's exactly the point. We used to say that you can't be in 2 places at the same time. And now with the modern technology that we have, you can be in 1,000 places at the same time. A teacher, for the first time, can be all things to all students. And that's what we'd like to talk about today.
Herb, before we carry this much further, is your point going to be during this session, are you going to carry this modern technology delivery process so far that we think that's the only way we can survive and deliver education?
I hope not. I don't know if you remember back in the early days of computers, there was a very important word that came out because of all the stuff that was generated. It was the word GIGO.
GIGO?
GIGO. It doesn't sound like much. Let me just write that.
Sounds like one of your relatives.
Yeah, thanks. G-I-G-O.
GIGO.
GIGO. And that was an acronym for garbage in, garbage out. Okay, GIGO. Now, you see, what that was saying basically was, look, you can have a computer, but if you don't program it right, what does it mean what the printout is? So what I'm saying is that with today's technology, if you really wanted to be sarcastic, what you could say is that with today's technology, we can now take lousy ideas and implement them with a great degree of excellence. It's sort of like saying, if I have stale donuts and I deliver them in a Rolls Royce, the donuts are still stale. And even worse, with a microwave today, I can basically reheat the donuts and the customer won't even know that they're stale till after we get them home.
Well, I'm a little disappointed. That doesn't sound like an upbeat comment for an upbeat guy like you.
Okay, but it's going to become upbeat in a minute, because one of the things I'm not sure I've emphasized enough in our discussion is the fact that the classroom teacher is an indispensable adjunct to what we're doing here. Videotapes, whatever you want to use, can never replace the classroom teacher. It can only augment what the teacher is doing. And what I'm saying is we're going to need that classroom teacher for mastery of the material, for mastery of motivation, mastery of self-esteem, and then when all of those things are in place, then we can talk about the delivery system.
Well, I know you personally, Herb. I know you've tried all kinds of models and motivational kinds of things. You have a national reputation. Tell me a little bit about the models you've built. I know there's one program called Gateway to Mathematics. Does that try to do what you're talking about right now?
It really does. It does it in several ways. The delivery system is just one of the components. I do have videotapes in there. But the thing that's interesting is that even though it's my course, and I teach that course live, those tapes are only to supplement what I'm doing in class. For example, sometimes when a class is over, let's suppose it's Wednesday, and the class isn't going to meet again until Friday. Very often the teacher will say something like, well, this is only Wednesday, you have till Friday. If you don't understand it, look the material over and you'll understand it better. Now you see, the point that I'm making is, if the student doesn't understand what you're talking about on Wednesday and doesn't have recourse to hearing you again, how's he going to understand it any better on Friday? So basically the idea was to have a videotape that the student could watch over and over, or the single parent who was out of school one day because the daycare center was closed. See, that parent could use the tape to get caught up better. See, that was basically the idea behind why having the videotapes. And there's a true story that really motivated this for the prisons. I was teaching a course in Massachusetts to 14 lifers. Now, they're not going to go anyplace by and large. 14 lifers. It was being offered through a community college. I was told by the dean that I could not extend the semester. In other words, they wanted this course done in 12 weeks. And I said, where are these guys going after the 12 weeks? The answer was, well, this is the way we always do things. Well, you see, to me, this is just a glaring example of something that I think is very funny. Saying to lifers, you've got to finish the course in 12 weeks. In fact, that's one of the problems we have with prison education. Even where we educate the inmates, sometimes by the time they get out, in other words, let's suppose a person got the GED or learned a trade his second year in prison and got out 8 years later. He's forgotten the material by that time because he hasn't had reinforcement. Whereas if the stuff was on videotape, we could do things that way. See, but I think we're locked into a certain situation that
What
says
you're
you're
calling
supposed to.
self-paced is what you're really
Yeah,
calling
I think, yeah, self-paced.
But isn't that, one of the criticisms we've had in education for years is we create artificial methods and environments, and the real world's not self-paced. I mean, when the schoolboy becomes the working man, his employer expects him to do what he's supposed to do in a certain given time. So
Yeah.
don't we set up an artificial climate by
You're
making
right.
them think?
That's the most common complaint I get. In fact, I've heard teachers do that. They'll say to a student, I want this assignment in on time, and you get a 0 if it's not in on time, because in the real world, they won't put up with this stuff being late. Well, first of all, I'm not sure in the real world whether it's that crucial or not. Secondly, if it is that crucial, as soon as the student gets penalized, that's that relevancy idea again. As soon as it costs the student something on their sense of values, I think they'll change that way. But the real important thing is, Bob, I think that the real world is self-paced. I'll give you an example of that. I think this is a good place to bring in our sports analogy again.
Okay.
I want to show you an example of what's considered permissive in the classroom. It's called great strategy on the football field. Okay? Sounds far-fetched? Let's look at the example. A football coach wants to teach his offense a new play. Right? The play is so intricate that the coach feels if the defense is on the field at the time, it will interfere with the flow of the offensive players. In other words, there's so much timing involved here that the coach doesn't want the defense in the way as the players get more familiar with the play. So he tells the defensive unit to sit down while the offensive unit runs through the play. Not one member of the defensive unit ever says to the coach, hey coach, I think in a real game, the other team's defense is going to be out there, and if our guys can't run the play any better than this, they're going to get killed. See, no coach in his right mind knows that there's going to be no defense out there when he plays the game. What is the coach really doing? He's letting the people run the play in slow motion till they get the feel of it. He's not going to make it part of the game plan till they can run it in everyday speed. In other words, there's no correlation between saying I'm going to teach self-paced even though I recognize the real world is not self-paced. See, even if the real world isn't self-paced and people have to perform at a certain rate, why can't they learn to become comfortable at that rate? You see, in a way that's comfortable to them, that they don't have to worry about rushing through something just because somebody says you're not learning it fast enough. It would be like me being a voice teacher and teaching one of my students, even though she can sing better than Marian Anderson, I'll teach her to sing faster. It makes absolutely no sense to me that way at all. See, and so that's the first thing I feel about self-pacing. See, let me share with you a philosophy that really bothers me. In the learning process, there are basically two parameters. Now, if that sounds like a big word, it's basically two variables. There are two things that we measure, it seems, in American education. One is how well did the student learn the material, and the other one is how long did it take. Now, for reasons that I never fully understood, except for expediency, we have elected to make the amount of time for all students the same and to vary the degree of excellence. For example, in a college that's working by the semester system, everybody has one semester in which to finish the course, and at the end of that semester, we give out grades ranging from A to F. And I think that's what you're used to, isn't it? That's what I was used to. Well, let me give you a crazy analogy, which may not make sense, but it's one that makes a lot of sense to me. Imagine, for example, that I'm a furniture manufacturing company owner. I own a company that manufactures furniture. And I'm going to be out of town one particular day, and we're used to turning out about 500 pieces of furniture a day. So I say to my foreman, look, I'm going to be out of town today. But while I'm gone, I want you to make sure that the factory runs the same as it does when I'm here. By 5 o'clock today, I want 500 pieces of furniture out of the factory. It gets to be 4:30, and there's only 420 pieces out. And now the foreman panics because he has to get that 500 pieces. He sees a table which has no legs on it. He gives it a D- and he ships it out. He sees a chair that's not painted. He gives it a C+ and he ships it out. Bob, can you visualize what I'm saying? How long is he going to stay in business putting out furniture that way? Those two pieces of furniture are going to come back. And what's worse is nobody's going to buy from him again. Yet we do this in education all the time. And people say, for example, well, how else could we do it?
But isn't there some kind of a precedent? The furniture manufacturer who's been in business for years, let's make a parallel between either the coach or the teacher, knows that he should be able to produce two chairs a day. We as a teacher know that to learn a basic concept in math, English, no matter what the subject is, basically should take, I don't know, 5 weeks.
Okay.
When we get into self-paced, should it be open-ended totally? Or should we drive people to learn into some kind of pacing, even though it is under their own initiative?
Well, let me give you one example where I think see, if you can just show a person one place in which what they say can't happen, does happen, and it not only does happen, but it's approved of, then you're showing people it's just a matter of where you draw the dividing line. Mm-hmm. How do you get a driver's license? They don't say to you, you have 5 weeks in which to learn the material. They don't say you have 8 weeks. They don't come up to a person who's had only one lesson and say, gee, you did great on the road test, but this little old lady has failed 4 or 5 times and it will crush her morale if we let you pass now. Basically, when you go up to take a driver's license test, there's a certain degree of excellence that you're supposed to have, a certain degree of mastery. They take you out on the road, and if you have that degree of mastery, no matter how long it took, no matter how many times you failed the test, when you finally pass it, you're assumed to be a worthy driver. They don't put on your license that you flunked it the first 4 times. You see, you don't carry that F forever with you. So there is a precedent that way. You see, the real problem is everybody does have a pace at which they can learn comfortably, but it's not necessarily the same pace as somebody else. The thing that's neat about the videotape idea is that it can work in any format. For example, it can work in a format where there is no live teacher, where you say, this course wouldn't have been offered at all if it weren't on videotape because we can't afford a teacher or there is no teacher around. It can work, see, in that extreme situation. It can work in conjunction with a regular teacher, where the teacher gives the motivation and the videotapes act as a peer group tutor, an electronic tutor, to take students in different places at different times. But even in the most traditional situation, there are cases where the student is on chapter 4, as we mentioned, I think, at other places, not tapes. Student is on chapter 4 when the professor is on chapter 7. Why should that student become an attrition figure? Simply because of the fact that their pace wasn't fast enough to keep up with the instructor. That's all I'm saying. How many students do we lose every year just because of an arbitrarily prescribed pace?
But you know, is there a final point then? My point to you in the open-endedness, let's assume that you have a 1-semester course and the student takes 5 semesters. Is it 5, 105, 205?
Yeah. Let me tell you what I think. First of all, before we get any further, to make sure that people understand this isn't just for the slower learner, keep in mind that there are certain students who can learn a semester course in 5 or 6 weeks. So with this kind of a system, a student might be able to learn 2 or more courses in the same time that we now allow for 1. But let me tell you, in terms of building up a student's self-esteem, what's important about my method. In my method, and when I say my method, it's not really mine. Other people have done it. You know, I steal it from somebody else, and after a month, I think I made it up. But basically, the idea is this. In my system, or whatever system you want to call this, there's only 3 possibilities. The student either finishes the course with sufficient mastery, you see, on or before the regular prescribed time, or the student is still learning. The course is taking more than the regular term, but he's still learning, or the student himself decides to drop the course. That's the only 3 things that can happen. He either completes it successfully, he's still striving to complete it successfully, or he drops the course, which, by the way, most students will do if they haven't passed it in 2 or 3 semesters. You see what I'm saying that way? Mm-hmm. Now, of course, some people say to me, hey, what difference does it make whether the student drops the course or you fail him? He's still out of the course. And you see, the point I want to make in terms of the student feeling good about themselves is, in fact, I talk to presidents of community colleges in the same way. We're very, very concerned about attrition, people dropping our courses, failing our courses, and we talk about our attrition rate, which sometimes is as high as 40%. And I would like to see attrition modified by the words hardcore and softcore. You see, hardcore attrition would be the student wants to stay in school, but we don't let him. Softcore attrition is the student is eligible to stay in school, but prefers not to. Do you see the difference between these 2? Mm-hmm. If the student drops out of school voluntarily, that's now a value judgment that the student has made. You see, and if we lose 40% of our students, what the heck? Ted Williams went into the Baseball Hall of Fame for making an out 60% of the time that he was up. That's what a 400 hitter is in baseball. But I think it's a very, very important thing to allow the student the human dignity to decide whether they think they've had problems or not. In other words, by the student making the conscious decision that they want to drop the course, you're no longer into that thing, he flunked me. Have you ever heard students talk that way, by the way?
Sure.
Two students are comparing grades. One says to the other one, how'd you make out? He says, I got an A. How'd you make out? He says, he flunked me. See, it's never he gave me an A. See, but I got the A, he flunked me. I'd like to have students be able to say, well, I thought it over, and I decided to drop out. You see, I think the greatest thing that America promised people was access. That's what the Statue of Liberty concept is all about, access. We never promised you a rose garden. We never promised you that you're going to have success, but we promised access. And see, basically, take, for example, an unhappy automobile mechanic. He is miserable. He's unhappy with what he's doing. He says things like, if only somebody had given me a chance to go to college. Now let's say through the open door enrollment policy of the community college, he has a chance to study engineering. And after 2 years, he decides on his own that he can't handle it. By the way, of course, Bob, if he can handle it, that was a wonderful thing that we let him in. And most of our community colleges measure their success by how their successful students do. What's a successful student? A guy who graduated. But what about our successful student who didn't graduate? What about that unhappy automobile mechanic who comes to college for 2 years, finds out on his own terms that he can't handle it, and now voluntarily goes back to being an automobile mechanic, but now, Bob, he's a happy automobile mechanic. You see, we gave him access. He had his chance at it, okay? And so he feels good about that. And once you feel good, we talked about that before too.
Sure.
Once you feel good about yourself, you can now feel good about helping others. The unhappy automobile mechanic is not going to coach a little league team. Because why do nice things for somebody else if you're hurting yourself? You see, I think in a certain sense, Bob, if you want to get back to the community college as a symbol, not necessarily as the entity that we're talking about, the community college movement has already proven to our country that we now have access for everybody. The thing that we haven't proven yet is that we have equal opportunity. See, I used to believe that access and equal opportunity meant the same thing. See, for example, I would say, well, if I take everybody into school, I'm giving them all an equal opportunity. But the thing I didn't realize until much later was that it was like the dry cleaning store that says in by 10, out by 5. We took everybody in September, and most of them were out by January. What was supposed to be the open door policy had become the revolving door policy.
You know, I'm convinced as an educator, you convince me, as you always do, that we really have to meet that need, as we've talked about in a previous series. And you may even convince me as a learner, because we've all been learners. But how about a taxpayer? I hire you to teach 25 students in a semester, and I have to hire you for 5 years at the mastery level type of learning process that you've put on the table. That's pretty expensive, isn't it?
Yeah, it could be. See, that's the other thing that's nice about this delivery system. You see, once the tape is made, it's the same old tape over and over and over again. It can be played and replayed. And for example, what I'm saying is that suppose a student takes more than one semester. The instructor, who's the live facilitator, is still there to answer questions for the students who are taking the course currently. This student simply would be using the same instructor just to ask a few extra questions. You see what I'm visualizing here, Bob? It's sort of like the old one-room schoolhouse. The one-room schoolhouse. The teacher is still just as important as always, but is playing a different role. It's the videotape that's doing most of the teaching. In fact, I've just proposed this to the Department of Corrections in Massachusetts, and I think that we're going to be working on that too. You know, one of the things that we don't notice a lot is that by the time an inmate gets an associate's degree, which many inmates now get, because let's face it, whether you like to admit it or not, the associate's degree has become the entry-level credential that the high school diploma used to be. But what happens is it costs about $25,000 per inmate for the associate's degree. And that sounds like a lot, doesn't it, Bob? Sounds like an awful lot. The reason it's a lot is because the inmate takes the same course over and over again. The inmate registers for the course, 3 weeks later gets transferred, or for some reason or another gets into a situation where they can't come to classes regularly, and the next thing you know, it's too late to continue. And most colleges have this policy, don't they, Bob, that after the first 3 weeks there's no money refunded? See, my system would say something like this. The inmate, whether it's a Pell Grant or whatever it is, pays a certain amount for the course. And once that amount is paid, that's it forever. In other words, if the inmate finishes in one term, that's how much it costs for one term. If it takes 6 terms, it's the same cost. See, and ultimately, the inmate just either completes the course or the same thing we were talking about before. He can only fail to complete the course if he himself drops it.
Well, the title of our segment here is Getting Everyone in the Upper Half. Does this mastery learning model that you've put forth get everybody in the upper half?
Yeah, I think so. It depends how you define upper half. Let's suppose that we go back to the driving school analogy again. Let's suppose that the driving school says that upper half mastery means that you can pass the road test. See, what I'm saying is, if we say in a math course to a student, for you to get out of this course, you're going to have to demonstrate that you can do this, 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 and this. And no matter how long it takes, that's how long you're going to be in the course. See, now either the student is what? Still in the course, if they haven't voluntarily dropped it, or else they've achieved that. So basically, even though it sounds tongue-in-cheek, what I'm saying is, yes, with this system, everybody can be in the upper half, but not necessarily all at the same time.
Well, as always, I'm going to pin you down. Our time is getting limited here, but I'd like a few applications of how you would do that.
Okay.
Specific applications.
And this is always a hard thing to do because there's so many applications. Reminds me of that bumper sticker I just saw.
What's that?
It says, so many pedestrians, so little time. I mean, basically, I don't know where to begin over here. Let me try to begin with an example that comes up, in my opinion, in math all the time. And that is that most people have trouble with math, not because they're bad at math, but because they have a language problem. I thought maybe I could go to the board again and show you an example that starts out as an English problem again, but will turn into a math problem very quickly. And I'll show you where the self-pacing comes in this. See, let's suppose that I'm a foreign student trying to learn English as a second language. I understand concepts, but I don't know the language. So my English teacher teaches me the sentence, John is taller than Bill. And I think about this in my own language, and I know what that means. John is like this, Bill is like this. Now the teacher says, I want to test your mastery of English. What I would like you to do is to paraphrase this sentence so that Bill's name comes before John's. In other words, I want the sentence to mean the same thing, but it's going to be Bill is something than John. Now, I certainly, by understanding the concept, know that the word taller doesn't belong here. I mean, John can't be taller than Bill and Bill taller than John at the same time. So I recognize that if John is taller than Bill, Bill must be shorter than John, right? That's simple enough, isn't it?
Right.
Is it possible that I don't know the word shorter, though? Remember, I'm learning English now. I know the concept of shorter. Once you learn the word taller, do you automatically know the word shorter, or do you have to learn that too? See, he may feel like saying, I know Bill is untaller than John. See, unfortunately, untaller isn't a word. See, the opposite of familiar is unfamiliar. The opposite of even is uneven. But the opposite of taller isn't untaller, it's shorter. So is it possible that the student understands the first sentence but doesn't know the word shorter? But obviously now it's a language problem. It's not a conceptual problem. He just doesn't know the word. Well, look, suppose I write down 1 week is 7 days. Now the person says to me, rewrite this same sentence so that the word day and week are interchanged. So 1 day is how many weeks? Well, look, I know that since it takes 7 days to make a week, 1 day must be what? 1 of the 7 days. Is it possible, though, that I haven't learned that 1 out of 7 is written as 1/7? You see, psychologically, most people are not afraid to see the first sentence, but they are afraid of the second sentence. And therefore, I want that person to see that if he understands that 1 week is 7 days, but doesn't understand that 1 day is 1/7 of a week, that's a language problem, you see. So if I go up to a little kid and I say, son, you're so much bigger than your little brother. Why don't you share the candy with him so that you keep 2/3 and he keeps 1/3? He doesn't know what I'm talking about. He says, I'll humor him, and as soon as he's gone, I'm going to do it my way. He says, 2 for me, 1 for him. 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 What's he doing? He's taking 2/3 without knowing that. In fact, if you notice over here, I've written 3 down 4 times. I've taken what? 2, 4, 6, 8? This kid has solved the problem that 2/3 of 12 is 8 without even knowing what a fraction is or without even knowing what a whole number is. Now, what I'm driving at is I can say this in class, and the kid can say to me, I think I understand that. But what happens on the tape? He can watch that over and over and over. He also has a study guide that gives him additional examples. And he works at his pace and doesn't get to adding fractions until he's at least comfortable with the notion of what a fraction is, which is very hard to do when you're teaching everybody at the same pace. I don't know if that's a good example.
I think
of
it's
it.
an excellent example, and I'm sure you could talk for days and weeks about
I told
multi.
you, when I was in Elmira, I gave a talk once, and one of the reporters said to my wife, your husband is outspoken, and she said, by whom?
Let's not close on that. Let's
Okay.
close on you giving me and the group a good summary of what you're trying to get across in this particular segment, maybe a sentence or two,
Well, basically, it's that we all learn at different paces. Do I have time to tell you a joke?
quickly.
It's an ethnic joke, and being ethnic, I think it's okay for me to use one. It was a Jewish man and a Chinese man at a bar. And all of a sudden, for no apparent reason, the Jewish man took his drink and threw it at the Chinese man. Chinese man said, what was that for? The Jewish man said, that was for Pearl Harbor. Chinese man said, Pearl Harbor, that was the Japanese. The Jewish man said, doesn't matter to me. Japanese, Chinese, Burmese, Vietnamese, it's all the same to me. A few minutes later, without any hint at all, the Chinese man took his drink and threw it at the Jew. And the Jew said, what was that for? And the Chinese man said, that was for sinking the Titanic. And the Jew said, Titanic, that was an iceberg. And the Chinese man said, iceberg, Goldberg, Greenberg, it's all the same to me. You see, all of our students look alike when we're looking at them that way. They don't learn at the same pace. They learn at different paces. And if we could take that into account, I think the success rate in colleges would go up 40 to 50% just by that alone.
Well, that's interesting. It's not only making education relevant to meet the needs of the individual, but allowing him or her the time to have those needs be met. And if that's mastery learning, as you call it, or self-pacing, that's
right.
what we have to do
And coming
regardless
back-
of the level
sure,
of education.
But coming back to our coaches team, that is considered standard operating procedure in sports and the motor registry of motor vehicles. We're doing it in other places.
Well, more and more I'm becoming more of a coach and less of a teacher. I hope that doesn't happen, but
I'm
the points
becoming
are
less
well
of
made.
both, but
less of
it's
both.
fun. It's
Well,
fun.
thank you very much, Dr. Herb Gross, for this very stimulating half hour.
Thank you, Bob.